The letter arrived 3 weeks after everything Brody Dalton owned had turned to ash, and he almost threw it into the creek without opening it. His hands, still wrapped in bandages from trying to save the barn, trembled as he recognized his own handwriting on the envelope, a letter he had written 4 months ago to a matrimonial agency in Boston, back when he still had a ranch house, livestock, and hope for a future that included a wife and children. Now he had nothing but a burned foundation, a tent pitched near the creek, and a gelding that had survived only because it had been out grazing when the fire started. The September wind carried the smell of charred wood across his Wyoming property, a constant reminder of the lightning strike that had destroyed everything in a single terrible night. Brody sat on a rock by the water and opened the letter with his knife. The handwriting was neat, feminine, the loops and curves speaking of education and care. Her name was Zelda Langston, and she was accepting his proposal. She would arrive in Rawlins on the afternoon train, October 15, 1882. That gave him exactly 3 weeks. He read the letter twice, his chest tightening with each word. She wrote about her excitement at starting a new life in Wyoming, her dreams of a home and family, her gratitude that someone wanted her despite her advanced age of 24. She mentioned that she had been teaching school in Boston but longed for open spaces and a husband who would treat her with kindness. The letter was warm, hopeful, and completely unaware that she was coming to a pile of ruins. Brody folded the letter and pressed it against his forehead. He should write back and tell her not to come. That would be the honest thing to do. But the postal service being what it was, his letter might not reach her before she left, and even if it did, what then? She had probably already given up her position, packed her belongings, spent money on the train ticket. And more than that, something in her words had stirred something in his chest that the fire had not managed to burn away. He looked at the blackened timbers where his house had stood. His father had built that house with his own hands, had raised Brody and his sister there until fever took them both when Brody was 19. That had been 6 years ago. Brody had worked the ranch alone since then, building it up, making it profitable, finally feeling ready to share it with someone. And now it was gone, but the land was still here. The creek still rang clear and cold. The mountains still rose purple and magnificent to the west. And Brody still had 2 working hands, a strong back, and 3 weeks. He stood up, decision made. If Zelda Langston was willing to travel 1,500 miles to marry a man she had never met, the least he could do was have a roof to put over her head when she arrived. The next morning, Brody rode into Rawlins with a list and his remaining money, which amounted to $63 he had kept in his saddlebag instead of the house. It was not much, but it would have to be enough. The town was busy with freight wagons and cowboys, the smell of horses and leather mixing with wood smoke from the shops along the main street. At the lumber yard, he found Tom Henderson marking boards for a shipment. Tom had been at school with Brody, back when they were both more interested in fishing than arithmetic. His face fell when he saw Brody's bandaged hands. "Heard about the fire," Tom said, setting down his pencil. "Real sorry, Brody. Your father was a good man, and that was a fine house." "It was," Brody agreed. "I need lumber, Tom, enough for a small house, maybe 20 by 20 feet, 2 rooms to start." Tom whistled low. "That is going to run you at least $80, and that is just for basic pine boards, nothing fancy. I have 63. Brody, and I can pay you the rest by spring. You know I am good for it. I've got cattle still scattered in the hills, and I can round them up once I have shelter built. I just need enough to get started." Tom scratched his jaw, considering. Finally, he nodded. "Your father once fronted mine 6 months of feed when we had a hard winter. I have not forgotten that. You get me that $17 by April, we will call it square. Relief flooded through Brody. You have my word. I will have the lumber delivered tomorrow. You want help raising it? I would be grateful. I will bring my brother. Between the three of us, we can get walls up in a few days. Brody shook his hand, careful of his burns. Thank you, Tom. At the general store, he bought nails, a hammer to replace the one lost in the fire, a saw, and a small cook stove that the proprietor, Mrs. Chen, was willing to sell at a discount because it had a dent in the side. She threw in a sack of beans, one of flour, and a tin of coffee. You need dishes, she said, her accent still carrying traces of her native Cantonese, though she had been in Wyoming for 10 years. Blankets, a table and chairs. I will come back for those, Brody said, though they both knew his money was nearly gone. Mrs. Chen disappeared into the back and returned with a crate. These are mismatched, plates from different sets, cups with chips. I cannot sell them full price. You take for $2. Brody looked in the crate and saw serviceable dishes, a few pieces of flatware, 2 cups that were not too badly chipped. Mrs. Chen, your father bought from me for 20 years. He never complained about my prices, never treated me different because I look different. You take the dishes, Brody Dalton. You need them more than I need $2. He paid her and loaded everything onto his gelding, his throat tight. People in Rawlins had long memories, and his father had been a fair man. It seemed that counted for something still. The lumber arrived the next day on a wagon driven by Tom and his younger brother Martin. They unloaded it near the old foundation, and Tom walked the property, his experienced eye measuring and calculating. You have got good flat ground here, he said. Foundation is still solid in places where the fire was not too hot. We can build right on top of it, save you having to lay new stones. They worked from dawn until dark for the next 5 days. Brody's hands screamed in protest, the burns not fully healed, but he pushed through the pain. They framed the walls, raised them one by one, secured them with temporary braces. Martin, who was only 18 but strong as an ox, did the heavy lifting while Tom and Brody measured and nailed. By the end of the first week, 4 walls stood upright, and Brody had the beginning of a house. Roof next, Tom said, wiping sweat from his face. That is the important part. Everything else you can do over time, but you need a roof before the snow comes. They spent another 4 days on the roof, laying joists and covering them with pine boards, then tacking down tar paper that Tom had brought from the lumber yard at cost. It was not fancy, but it would keep out the rain and snow. While Martin cut window holes and fitted them with frames, Brody and Tom built a door and hung it on leather hinges. You need glass for those windows, Tom said on the 10th day, standing back to survey their work. And you should think about a floor instead of just dirt. But you have got 4 walls and a roof, Brody. You have got yourself a house. Brody looked at the structure, emotion welling up. It was rough and small, nothing like the spacious home his father had built, but it was solid and it was his, built with help from friends who had not forgotten his family. I cannot thank you enough. Just invite us to the wedding, Tom said, grinning. Martin told me he saw you reading a letter from Boston. That true? You got yourself a mail-order bride coming. Heat crept up Brody's neck. She arrives in 5 days. Well then, Tom clapped him on the shoulder, careful to avoid his injured hands. Guess you better get to work on making this place fit for a lady. After Tom and Martin left, Brody stood in the empty house and tried to see it through Zelda's eyes. The walls were bare pine, the floor was packed dirt, the windows were just holes that would let in cold air. There was no furniture, no curtains, no warmth. It looked like exactly what it was, a desperate man's rushed attempt to provide shelter, but he had no time for despair. He had 5 days. He rode back to Rollins and spent the last of his money on glass panes for the windows, putty to hold them in place, and paint just enough for one wall, because that was all he could afford. He chose white, thinking it might make the interior seem brighter. At the widow Harrison's farm outside town, he traded work for furniture. He spent 2 full days repairing her broken fence line and mucking out her barn, and in return, she gave him a table that had belonged to her late husband, 2 chairs, a bed frame, and a mattress stuffed with straw. "It is not much," she said, her weathered face kind, "but it is a start. Your young lady can make it into a home. If she does not take one look and get back on the train," Brody said. Mrs. Harrison laughed. "If she came all the way from Boston to marry a man she has never met, she has got pioneer spirit. Give her a chance before you decide she is too delicate for frontier life." He carried the furniture back in her wagon, which she loaned him for the day, and arranged it in the house. The table went in the larger room, near where the cook stove would sit. The bed went in the smaller room, which would serve as a bedroom. He hung a blanket in the doorway between the rooms for privacy. The paint dried quickly in the autumn air. He had only been able to afford enough to paint one wall, the wall that would face the door when Zelda first entered. He painted it carefully, making the interior just a little less rough, a little more hopeful. On the 13th day, he installed the window glass, his bandaged fingers clumsy with the putty. The windows were not perfect. One pane sat slightly crooked, but they would keep out the wind. He swept the dirt floor until it was as clean as dirt could be, then laid down 2 threadbare rugs he had salvaged from the burned house, their edges singed but their centers still intact. On the morning of October 15th, Brody rode into Rollins to meet the afternoon train. He had bathed in the cold creek, shaved carefully, and put on his best clothes, denim trousers without too many patches, a clean cotton shirt, a leather vest his mother had made before she died, and his father's good hat, which had been in the saddlebag during the fire. He looked at himself in the window reflection of the general store and saw a man trying to hide his desperation behind clean clothes and hope. The train station was busy with freight handlers and travelers. Brody stood on the platform, his heart hammering against his ribs. What if she took one look at him and refused? What if she had imagined someone more refined, more successful? What if he was not what she wanted? The train whistle sounded in the distance, and his mouth went dry. The locomotive pulled into the station with a screech of brakes and a cloud of steam. Passengers began to disembark: a businessman with a leather case, a family with 3 small children, an older couple arguing about luggage. And then he saw her. She stood on the train steps, one gloved hand on the railing, looking out at Rollins with wide eyes. She wore a gray traveling dress with a modest bustle, a hat with a single blue ribbon, and carried a small carpetbag. Her hair was dark, almost black, pulled back in a practical bun. Her face was pale from travel and she looked terrified. Brody stepped forward, removing his hat. "Miss Langston." Her eyes found him, and for a moment they just looked at each other. She was pretty in a quiet way, with a pointed chin and serious eyes. There was intelligence in her face, and something else, a kind of careful hope that matched his own. "Mr. Dalton." Her voice was soft, with the clipped vowels of educated Boston. "Yes, madam, I am Brody Dalton. Welcome to Wyoming." She stepped down from the train, and he saw that she was of medium height, the top of her hat coming to about his chin. Up close, he could see freckles across her nose and that her eyes were hazel, more green than brown. "You are younger than I expected," she said, then blushed. "I am sorry, that was rude. I only meant that your letters sounded so serious. I imagined someone older." "I am 25, he said. "I hope that is not too young. I am 24. I think we shall do fine." She smiled, a small nervous thing that made his chest feel strange. "You have more luggage, 2 trunks. They said they would unload them." They waited in awkward silence while the freight handlers brought out her trunks. They were substantial, leather bound with brass fittings, and probably contained everything she owned. Brody loaded them onto his horse with difficulty, grateful that the gelding was strong and patient. "It is about 5 miles to the ranch," he said, helping her onto the horse. "I am sorry I do not have a wagon," but he hesitated, not sure how to explain. "But you have had some difficulties recently," Zelda finished quietly. She was looking at his bandaged hands. "Your letters stopped coming 2 months ago. I worried that you had changed your mind." Brody swung up behind her, careful to give her as much space as possible on the horse. "I need to tell you something before we get there, all right?" As they rode out of Rawlins, he told her about the fire. His voice was steady, but it cost him something to put it into words: the lightning strike, the spreading flames, his futile attempts to save anything, the complete destruction of his home. He told her about the tent by the creek, the decision to build a new house, the help from Tom and Mrs. Chen and Mrs. Harrison. He told her everything except how scared he was that she would leave. Zelda was quiet for a long time after he finished. The horse plodded steadily forward, and the sun moved across the sky, and still she said nothing. Finally, as they crested the hill that looked down on his property, she spoke. "You could have written and told me not to come." "Yes, madam, but you did not." "No, madam." "Why?" Brody looked down at his property. From this distance, the new house looked small and fragile against the vast Wyoming landscape. The black scar of the fire was visible around it, a reminder of destruction. But the creek sparkled in the sunlight, and the mountains rose majestic and eternal, and it was still the most beautiful place he knew. "Because I read your letter," he said honestly. "And I thought maybe you were the kind of person who would understand that starting over is not the same as having nothing." Zelda turned in the saddle to look at him. Her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "I gave up my teaching position. I said goodbye to my sister and my students. I spent nearly all my savings on the train ticket. If you had told me not to come, I would have had nothing and nowhere to go." His stomach dropped. "I am sorry. I should have written. I should have told you." "No," she interrupted. "You misunderstand. I am not angry, Mr. Dalton. I am relieved. You could have taken the easy path and left me to figure out my own problems. Instead, you built me a house. No one has ever done anything like that for me before." They rode down the hill in silence, but it was a different kind of silence now, warmer somehow. When they reached the house, Brody helped her dismount and then stood nervously while she approached the door. "It is not much," he said. "Just 2 rooms. The windows are new and the roof is solid. I know it is not what you expected. May I go in?" He opened the door for her, and she stepped inside. He watched her face carefully as she looked around at the bare walls except for the one painted white, at the simple furniture, at the cookstove with its dent, at the curtainless windows and dirt floor. She walked through both rooms, her skirts rustling, her expression unreadable. When she came back to the main room, she removed her gloves and hat and set them carefully on the table. Then she turned to him, and she was smiling, a real smile that reached her eyes. "You built this in 3 weeks." "Yes, madam, I had help, but it is wonderful." Brody blinked. "It is a shack." "It is a home," Zelda corrected. "Or it will be. You painted a wall for me, Brody Dalton. You put glass in the windows, you bought dishes and made a bed. You did all of this knowing I might take one look and leave." "Are you going to leave, I mean?" She walked over to him and held out her hand. "I came to Wyoming to marry you and to build a life. Nothing about a fire changes that unless it changes things for you. Do you still want a wife?" He took her hand carefully, mindful of his bandages. Her skin was soft, her grip firm. "Yes, madam, more than anything." "Then we should probably start by you calling me Zelda instead of madam, and we should find a preacher." They were married 2 days later in Rawlins, at the small church that served the scattered faithful of the county. Zelda wore her best dress, a deep blue that brought out the green in her eyes, and Brody wore his father's suit, which Mrs. Chen had been keeping safe in her shop since the fire. Tom and his wife stood as witnesses, and Mrs. Chen and her husband came, along with Mrs. Harrison and a dozen other people from town who remembered Brody's father and wanted to wish the young couple well. The preacher was a circuit rider named Reverend Matthews, a lean man with kind eyes who had baptized Brody as a baby. He kept the ceremony short, understanding that neither Brody nor Zelda were comfortable with attention. When he pronounced them husband and wife, Brody kissed Zelda's cheek softly, carefully, and she smiled at him with tears in her eyes. The women of the town had organized a small celebration at the church, with coffee and cake and sandwiches. It was modest but heartfelt, and Zelda moved through the crowd with grace, thanking everyone for their welcome, asking questions about Rawlins and Wyoming, making an effort to remember names. Brody watched her and felt something shift in his chest, a kind of cautious happiness he had not expected. When they finally rode back to the ranch in the late afternoon, the autumn sun was turning the landscape gold and purple. Zelda sat in front of him on the horse, more relaxed than she had been on their first ride, and Brody let himself notice things he had been too nervous to see before: the way her hair curled slightly at her neck, where it escaped her bun, the faint scent of lavender that clung to her clothes, the way she pointed at an eagle circling overhead and said, "Oh," in a voice full of wonder. At the house, he helped her down and then stood awkwardly, unsure of what came next. They were married now, but they were still strangers. The sun was setting and the evening air was growing cold. "I should see to the horse," he said. "And I need to bring in your trunks from where I stored them in the lean-to. Are you hungry? I have beans and bread and I can make coffee." "That sounds perfect," Zelda said. "May I help?" They worked together to settle the house for the night. Zelda unpacked one of her trunks and brought out sheets for the bed, real linens that smelled of cedar. She made up the bed with quick, efficient movements while Brody brought in her trunks, and then cooked a simple dinner on the new stove. They ate at the small table, the silence between them comfortable now, and when darkness fell, Brody lit the 2 lanterns he had purchased in town. "The bedroom is yours," he said, clearing away the dishes. "I will sleep out here by the stove." Zelda looked up from folding a blanket. "We are married, Brody." "Yes, but," he struggled to find the words. "We do not know each other yet. I do not want you to feel pressured." She crossed the room and took his hand, the one that was less badly burned. "You are a good man. Your father raised you right. But we are husband and wife now, and I think we should start our marriage by trusting each other. I'm not afraid of you, and I do not need to be protected from my own husband. So unless you do not want to share the room with me—" "I do," he said quickly. "I just wanted you to know that we do not have to. We will figure it out," Zelda said gently. "Together. Is that all right?" "Yes." That night they lay together in the narrow bed, both still wearing their night clothes, both careful not to take up too much space. The darkness was complete except for the faint glow of the stove through the doorway. Outside, a coyote called and an owl answered. "Brody." Zelda's voice was small in the darkness. "Yes. Thank you for not giving up on the ranch, on me, on everything." He found her hand under the blankets and held it carefully. "Thank you for staying. Where else would I go? This is home now." In the morning, they began the work of building a life together. Brody showed Zelda the property, the creek with its clear water, the burned remains of the barn, the pastures where his cattle should have been but were now scattered. She walked beside him, her practical boots crunching on the frost-touched grass, asking questions about everything. "How many cattle did you have before the fire?" 23 head. "They ran off during the fire and I have not had time to round them up. They are probably scattered in the hills, maybe some crossed onto neighboring properties. Can you find them? If I had help, maybe, but it is just me now." Zelda stopped walking and looked at him. "It is not just you anymore. Teach me to ride properly and I will help you. Have you ever ridden a horse? I have ridden in carriages. How different can it be? Very different, as it turned out." Brody spent the next week teaching Zelda to ride, starting with the basics of mounting and sitting properly, then moving on to controlling the horse with the reins and her legs. She fell off twice, both times landing hard enough to knock the breath out of her, and both times she got back up with a determined set to her jaw that made Brody fall a little bit in love with her. By the end of the week, she could stay mounted at a trot, and Brody decided that was good enough to start looking for the cattle. They rode out together in the early mornings when the frost still clung to the grass, Zelda bundled in a borrowed coat and a knitted scarf, her cheeks pink with cold and exertion. They found 6 cattle the first week, grazing in a valley 3 miles from the ranch. It took hours to herd them back, with Zelda following Brody's instructions and learning by doing. When they finally got the cattle into the rough corral Brody had rebuilt, she slid off the horse and stood there breathing hard, her hair falling out of its pins, her dress dusty, looking more alive than he had ever seen her. "That was incredible," she said, her eyes shining. "I have never done anything like that before. You did really well. You are a natural. I am exhausted, but I want to do it again." They continued the search for the cattle every day, sometimes finding 1 or 2, sometimes coming home empty-handed. In the evenings, they worked on improving the house. Zelda proved to be resourceful, making curtains from flour sacks she carefully washed and dyed with tea, creating a small garden plot near the creek where she planned to plant vegetables in the spring, organizing their meager possessions into something that resembled a real home. She also proved to be educated in ways that surprised Brody. She had books in her trunks, thick volumes of poetry and literature and history, and in the evenings, she would read aloud to him while he worked on repairing tack or carving new handles for tools. Her voice was soothing, the stories a window into a world he had never known, and he found himself looking forward to those quiet hours by lamplight as much as anything else in his day. One evening in late October, as the first snow began to fall, Zelda closed her book and looked at him seriously. "Brody, we need to talk about money." He set down the bridle he was mending. "I know we are nearly out. I have been trying to figure out how to earn more, but with winter coming, I have some," she interrupted. "Not much, but some. I kept back a little from the train ticket." "Zelda, that is your money. It is our money now. That is what marriage means, and I have been thinking. I was a teacher in Boston. There is no school in Rawlins, but there are children on the surrounding ranches. What if I started a small school here once we get more settled? Families would pay something, even if it is just food or trade. It would help." Brody stared at her. "You want to teach? I loved teaching. And these children deserve an education just as much as children in Boston, maybe more because they have fewer chances. What do you think?" "I think you are remarkable," he said honestly, "and I think it is a good idea if you are willing." "I am willing. We are partners, Brody. We face this together." That night, Brody lay awake long after Zelda had fallen asleep beside him, thinking about the word she had used: partners. Not just husband and wife, but partners, working together toward a common goal. It was more than he had hoped for when he sent that first letter to the matrimonial agency. He had been looking for companionship, for help, for someone to share the burden of the ranch. Instead, He had found someone who made him want to be better, work harder, dream bigger. He turned carefully in the narrow bed and looked at her sleeping face, peaceful in the moonlight that came through the window. Her dark hair was loose on the pillow, and one hand rested near her cheek. Without thinking, he brushed a strand of hair from her forehead, and she stirred slightly, smiling even in sleep. "I am going to make this work," he whispered. "I promise you, Zelda, I am going to give you the life you deserve." November brought hard cold and early snows. Brody and Zelda fell into a rhythm of work and survival, each day focused on preparing for the worse weather to come. They had found 14 cattle now, nearly 2/3 of his original herd. The others were probably lost to predators or the elements, or had wandered so far they would never be found. Brody tried not to think about the money those lost cattle represented. Instead, he focused on what he had. The house was weathertight and warm, with the cookstove providing steady heat. They had enough food to last the winter if they were careful, supplemented by the rabbits Brody snared and the venison he got when he shot a deer in early November. Zelda proved to be an excellent cook, able to make filling meals from very little, and she taught Brody things he had never learned: how to make bread that was soft instead of hard as rocks, how to season stew so it tasted like something other than boiled meat, how to make coffee that did not taste like mud. In return, he taught her everything he knew about the land and animals. She learned to read weather signs, to recognize animal tracks in the snow, to understand the behavior of cattle and horses. She learned to shoot, surprising both of them by being a decent shot after only a few lessons. She was practical and unafraid of hard work, and she never complained even when her hands were red and raw from cold water or her back ached from carrying wood. They talked during the long evenings, really talked, learning each other's stories. Zelda told him about growing up in Boston, the youngest daughter of a seamstress who had died when Zelda was 12. Her older sister had raised her, but there had been little money and many mouths to feed. Teaching had been her escape and her passion, but the school had wanted to hire a married woman, someone more settled, and at 24, Zelda had seen the matrimonial advertisement as her chance for a new start. "I was not brave enough to go west on my own," she admitted. "I needed a reason, a destination. Your letter gave me that." "What did I say that convinced you?" she smiled. "You wrote about the mountains and the creek and the sound the wind makes through the grass. You wrote about wanting to build something that would last, about wanting children to raise and a partner to grow old with. You did not promise me luxury or ease. You promised me a real life, and that was what I wanted." Brody told her about his parents, about the fever that had taken them both within days of each other. He told her about the loneliness of running the ranch alone, about the long winters when he would go weeks without seeing another person. He told her about his dreams of expanding the herd, of building the ranch into something significant, of having a family to leave it to. "That house that burned," he said. "My father built it for my mother. It was his promise to her that she would always be safe and warm. When it burned, I felt like I had broken that promise, like I had let them both down." "You did not let anyone down," Zelda said firmly. "You could not control the lightning, and you are building again just like your father would have done. That is keeping the promise, Brody. That is honoring their memory." One night in mid-November, during a fierce snowstorm that rattled the windows and piled drifts against the door, Zelda sat up in bed suddenly. Brody, who had been half asleep, sat up too. "What is wrong?" "Nothing is wrong." She turned to him in the darkness, and even though he could not see her face clearly, he could hear the smile in her voice. "I just realized that I am happy. Really, truly happy. I have not felt like this in years. Even though we are snowed in with barely enough food and no money and a ranch that is half destroyed. Because of all that, she said. Because we are facing it together. Because we are building something. Because this is mine, ours in a way nothing in Boston ever was. Does that make sense? Yes, Brody said, and he pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her. She fit against him perfectly, her head tucked under his chin, her breath warm on his neck. It makes perfect sense. She tilted her face up, and in the faint light from the stove he saw her eyes searching his. Then she kissed him, gentle at first, then deeper, and Brody felt something in him break open, all the careful distance he had been maintaining dissolving in the warmth of her mouth on his. He kissed her back, his bandaged hands careful on her face, and she made a small sound of contentment that went straight through him. "I love you," she whispered against his lips. "I did not expect to, not this fast, but I do. I love you, Brody Dalton." "I love you too," he said, and realized it was absolutely true. Somewhere in the past month of work and conversation and shared struggle, he had fallen completely in love with his wife. "God, Zelda, I love you so much." They made love that night with the storm howling outside and the stove crackling softly, learning each other slowly, carefully, with patience and tenderness. Afterwards, Zelda cried, and when Brody asked if he had hurt her, she shook her head and said, "No, I am just so glad I came. I am so glad I did not give up." "Me too," he said, holding her close. "Me too." December was brutal, with temperatures dropping so low that the water in the bucket froze solid overnight. But inside their small house, Brody and Zelda were warm, cocooned in their growing love and shared purpose. They celebrated Christmas with a small pine tree Brody cut from the hills. Decorated with strings of dried berries, Zelda made, and paper ornaments she cut from old newspapers. They exchanged simple gifts. She gave him a new pair of gloves she had knitted from wool she had carefully unraveled from an old sweater, and he gave her a wooden box he had carved with a scene of mountains and a creek, a place to keep her treasures. "It is beautiful," she said, tracing the carving with one finger. "You are an artist. I am a rancher," he said, embarrassed. "You can be both." In January, the worst of the winter settled in. They were snowed in for 2 weeks straight, unable to even reach the cattle shelter Brody had built. They rationed food carefully and spent the days keeping the stove fed, playing cards with a battered deck Zelda had brought, reading, talking, and making love in the warm cocoon of their bed. By the time the snow cleared enough for Brody to dig out, they had learned each other completely, inside and out, and the small house felt like the center of the universe. "I would not trade this for anything," Zelda said one evening, watching Brody cook dinner because she had not been feeling well. "Not for all the fine houses in Boston. Are you sure you are all right? You have been sick in the mornings for a week now." She looked up at him, and there was something in her face that made his heart skip. "I am better than all right. I am fairly certain I am pregnant, Brody." He dropped the spoon he was holding. "You are, we are, yes." She was smiling, that wide, genuine smile that transformed her whole face. "I think we are going to have a baby." Brody crossed the room in 2 steps and pulled her into his arms, lifting her off her feet and spinning her around once before carefully setting her down, suddenly afraid of being too rough. "A baby. We are having a baby. Are you happy?" "Happy." "Zelda, I am." He could not find words big enough, so he kissed her instead, pouring everything he felt into that kiss, his love, his gratitude, his hope for the future. That night, lying in bed with his hand resting on Zelda's still flat stomach, Brody thought about the future for the first time in months without fear. Yes, money was tight. Yes, the ranch was still being rebuilt. Yes, there were 1,000 challenges ahead. But they would face them together, and now there would be 3 of them, a family, his family. "We need to make this place better," he said quietly. A proper floor, more furniture, maybe another room once the baby comes. We have time, Zelda said. The baby will not arrive until late summer. We will be ready. They were ready, but not for everything. In February, a winter storm brought Tom Henderson and his wife Emma to their door, half frozen and desperate. Their house had caught fire from a chimney spark, and they had barely escaped with their lives. Brody and Zelda took them in without hesitation, crowding 4 people into the small house, sharing their dwindling supplies, making do. For 2 weeks, they lived in close quarters while Tom and Brody worked to build a temporary shelter on the Henderson property. It was cramped and uncomfortable, but it taught Brody something important: that Zelda's generosity was not just for him, that she had a capacity for kindness that extended to everyone who needed it. She shared their food without complaint, gave up their bed so Emma could sleep comfortably, and spent hours helping Emma cope with the trauma of losing her home. When Tom and Emma finally left, pressing a small amount of money into Brody's hand as thanks despite his protests, Zelda stood in the doorway and waved until they were out of sight. Then she turned to Brody with tears in her eyes. Their home burned just like yours did. They lost everything. I know, but they will rebuild just like we did, and they have each other just like we do. That is what matters, Brody agreed, pulling her close. That is what always matters. Spring came late to Wyoming that year, but when it finally arrived, it was glorious. The snow melted, the creek ran high and fast, and the hills exploded in wildflowers. Brody and Zelda worked from dawn to dusk, planting Zelda's garden, repairing the cattle shelter, building a proper barn to replace the one that had burned. The money Tom had given them, combined with what they had saved by being frugal all winter, was enough to buy basic supplies and a few more cattle from a neighbor who was moving east. Zelda's pregnancy progressed smoothly. By April, she was showing clearly, her dresses tight around her middle. She glowed with health and happiness, though she tired more easily now and sometimes had to stop work to rest. Brody watched her constantly, worried that she was doing too much, but she always laughed off his concerns. Women have been having babies since the beginning of time, she reminded him. I am fine, Brody, strong as a horse. In May, word spread about Zelda's teaching background, and 3 families approached her about educating their children. She was thrilled, and despite Brody's worries, she began teaching twice a week in their home, transforming the main room into a classroom. 6 children ranging in age from 5 to 12 came on Tuesday and Thursday mornings, and Zelda taught them reading, writing, arithmetic, and geography. The families paid what they could: 1 in eggs, 1 in milk, 1 in actual money, $5 a month that felt like a fortune. I told you it would work, Zelda said triumphantly, counting the eggs and storing them carefully. We are going to be all right, Brody. Better than all right. She was right. By June, they had paid off the lumber debt to Tom, had money saved for the first time since the fire, and had a thriving garden that promised fresh vegetables all summer. The cattle were healthy and multiplying. The barn was finished, sturdy and spacious. And Zelda was 7 months pregnant, beautiful and radiant, talking constantly about the baby and making tiny clothes from scraps of fabric. Brody had never been so happy in his life. He would wake in the early mornings and lie there listening to Zelda breathe, feeling the baby kick against his hand when he rested it on her belly, and feel overwhelmed by the fullness of his life. He had been so sure the fire had destroyed everything, but instead, it had led him to a love deeper than he had imagined possible, to a family growing strong, to a future bright with promise. I wish my parents could see this, he told Zelda one evening as they sat on the porch he had just finished building, watching the sunset paint the mountains purple and gold. They would have loved you. "Tell me about them," she said, leaning against his shoulder. "I want to know everything so I can tell our children about their grandparents." He told her stories late into the night about his father's skill with horses, his mother's garden that had been the envy of the county, the way they had worked together as a team, finishing each other's sentences and never seeming to argue. He told her about the values they had taught him: honesty, hard work, kindness, community. He told her everything he could remember, and Zelda listened intently, her hand on her belly, storing it all away. "They would be proud of you," she said when he finally ran out of words. "You have honored them by building again, by not giving up, and you will teach our children the same values. We will make sure their legacy lives on." On August 3rd, 1883, as a thunderstorm rolled across the Wyoming hills, Zelda went into labor. Brody rode through the rain to fetch Mrs. Harrison, who had delivered half the babies in the county, and then spent the longest hours of his life pacing the porch while Zelda labored inside with Mrs. Harrison and Emma Henderson, who had come to help. He heard her cry out once, a sound that made him want to break down the door, but Emma came out and said firmly, "She is doing fine. First babies take time. Stop wearing a hole in the porch and go tend the horses or something useful." But he could not leave. He paced and prayed and listened to the thunder echo off the mountains, thinking about his own mother, who had been so strong, and about Zelda, who was strong in all the ways that mattered. He thought about the fire and the rebuilding, about the journey that had brought them here, about the improbable love that had grown between them. When the baby finally cried, a strong, lusty sound that carried through the walls, Brody's knees nearly buckled. He stood there gripping the porch railing while his heart hammered, and then Emma opened the door, grinning. "You have a son, Brody, a beautiful, healthy son, and Zelda is asking for you." He stumbled inside, not bothering to remove his wet boots. Zelda was propped up in bed, exhausted and pale but smiling, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in a blanket. Mrs. Harrison was cleaning up and Emma was bringing fresh water, but Brody only had eyes for his wife. "Come meet your son," Zelda said softly. He sat carefully on the edge of the bed and looked down at the baby. He was red-faced and wrinkled, with a shock of dark hair and tiny perfect fingers that gripped Brody's finger when he offered it. He was the most beautiful thing Brody had ever seen. "He is perfect," Brody whispered. "You are perfect." I cannot believe. His voice broke, and tears ran down his face without shame. "I know," Zelda said, her own eyes wet. "I know." They named him William after Brody's father, with the middle name Thomas after the man who had helped them rebuild. Tom Henderson cried when they told him, unashamed of his emotion. The baby was baptized in the Rollins church, with half the town in attendance, and Brody stood there holding his son and thought about how much had changed in less than a year. William was a good baby, healthy and strong, with a loud cry and an appetite that amazed them both. Zelda recovered quickly from the birth and was soon back to teaching her students, this time with William sleeping in a basket near her feet. Life settled into a new rhythm: feeding and diapers and sleepless nights, but also moments of perfect joy when William smiled or gripped Brody's finger or simply slept peacefully in Zelda's arms. "He looks like you," Zelda said one evening, studying William's face. "He has your nose and your stubborn chin." "Poor child," Brody joked, but secretly he was pleased. He wanted his son to have his father's features, wanted that connection across the generations. The ranch continued to prosper. By the end of William's first year, they had 30 cattle, a breeding pair of pigs, a flock of chickens, and 2 new horses. Brody had added 2 more rooms to the house, giving them space for William and for Zelda's teaching. They had real furniture now, purchased and not borrowed, and glass windows in every room. The garden produced abundantly, and Zelda learned to can vegetables for winter, filling shelves in the root cellar Brody had dug. More families asked about schooling, and by William's second birthday, Zelda was teaching 12 children 3 days a week. The money from teaching, combined with the profits from cattle sales, meant they were not just surviving but actually building savings. Brody hired a hand to help with the ranch work, a quiet young man named Peter who lived in a small cabin Brody built near the barn. "We are doing it," Zelda said one evening, nursing their second child, a daughter they had named Margaret after Zelda's mother. "We are actually building a real ranch, a real life. Sometimes I can hardly believe it." Brody looked around the house at William playing with carved wooden horses by the stove, at Zelda rocking baby Margaret, at the full cupboards and warm fire and solid walls. It was nothing like the grand house his father had built, but it was theirs, earned through hard work and determination and love. "I can believe it," he said, "because I see what happens when people do not give up. You did not give up when you saw the burned ranch. I did not give up when I thought everything was lost. We did not give up on each other, even when we were strangers. That is what built this, Zelda. That is what made it all possible. That and you building me a house in 3 weeks," she said, smiling. "Do not think I will ever forget that, Brody Dalton. You built me a house when you had nothing. That is when I knew." "Knew what?" "That I was going to fall in love with you, that this was going to work, that I had made the right choice coming here." She shifted Margaret to her shoulder, patting the baby's back gently. "I have never regretted it, not for a single moment." "Neither have I," Brody said, and he meant it with every fiber of his being. The years passed, each one bringing new challenges and new joys. William grew into a sturdy boy who loved the horses and followed Brody everywhere, asking endless questions about ranching and animals and the mountains. Margaret was quieter but observant, with her mother's intelligence and her father's stubbornness. They had a third child, another son they named Robert, and then a fourth, another daughter named Catherine. The ranch grew too. By 1890, they ran over 100 head of cattle and had built a reputation for quality stock. Brody hired more hands, built a proper bunkhouse, and expanded the barn twice. Zelda's school had outgrown their house, and the county built an actual schoolhouse in Rawlins with Zelda as the teacher, paying her a real salary. They were not rich, but they were comfortable, respected in the community, and deeply happy. On their 10th anniversary, Brody surprised Zelda with a gift he had been planning for months. He had hired a carpenter from Rawlins, and together they had built a new house, larger and more comfortable than the original small structure. It had a real parlor, a big kitchen, 4 bedrooms, and a porch that wrapped around 2 sides. It stood on the same foundation where the first burned house had been, a statement that they had not just survived but thrived. He brought Zelda to see it on an October afternoon, exactly 10 years from the day she had arrived in Rawlins. She stood in front of the house, her hand over her mouth, tears running down her face. When did you?" "I have been working on it for 6 months. Tom and Martin helped, and Peter and some of the other men. Everyone wanted to contribute something because everyone remembers what you did, how you came to a burned ranch and did not run away, how you built a school and taught their children, how you made this place a home. This is not just from me, Zelda. This is from everyone." She walked through every room, touching the walls, looking out the windows, marveling at the space and light and beauty. In the parlor, there was a new piano, another surprise, this one from the town women who had pooled their money to buy it because they knew Zelda had once played in Boston. "I do not deserve this," she whispered. "You deserve everything," Brody said, pulling her close. "You took a chance on a man with nothing. You worked beside me through everything. You gave me children and a home and a reason to keep going when things were hard. You deserve this and more." That night, they lay in their new bedroom in a new bed with real springs, looking out the window at the stars that filled the Wyoming sky. William was 11 now, almost ready to start really helping with the ranch. Margaret was 9, brilliant and curious, already reading at a high school level. Robert was 6, all energy and mischief. Catherine was 3, sweet and clinging to her mother's skirts. "Remember when we slept in that tiny bed in the 2-room house?" Zelda said, laughing softly. "We barely fit. We made it work. We made everything work." She rolled to face him, her hand on his cheek. "I love you more now than I did then. I did not think that was possible, but I do. You are a good man, Brody Dalton, the best man I have ever known." "I love you too," he said, kissing her softly. "You are my whole world, Zelda, you and the children. You are everything I never knew I needed." They made love in their new bed, unhurried and tender, the love between them as strong as it had ever been. Afterwards, Zelda fell asleep with her head on Brody's chest, and he lay awake, thinking about the improbable journey that had brought them here. A burned ranch, a mail-order bride arriving to ruins, a desperate man building a house in 3 weeks. None of it should have worked, and yet it had, because they had chosen to work together, to trust each other, to build something new from the ashes of what had been lost. He thought about his parents, about the legacy they had left him. His father had built a house for his mother, and that house had burned. But Brody had built again, and he had built stronger, not just in wood and nails, but in love and family and community. The fire had taken the physical structure, but it had not taken what mattered: the values, the commitment, the determination to create something lasting. William came into the bedroom the next morning, excited about the new house, asking if he could have the room with the window facing the barn. Margaret followed, already planning how to arrange her books in her new room. Robert and Catherine tumbled in after, and suddenly the bed was full of children and laughter, and Zelda was smiling that smile that still made Brody's heart skip, and he thought that this was what happiness looked like: not perfection, but love, family, and the knowledge that you had built something worth building. The years continued, bringing the inevitable changes. William grew into a man and took over more of the ranch responsibilities, showing the same dedication his grandfather had possessed. He married a girl from town, a rancher's daughter named Sarah, and they built a house on the far side of the property, staying close but creating their own space. Margaret shocked everyone by leaving for college in Denver, determined to become a doctor, the first woman from Rawlins to attempt such a thing. Robert took after his father, loving the ranch and the animals, content to work the land. Catherine, the youngest, was the musician, spending hours at the piano Brody had given Zelda, filling the house with music. Brody's hair turned gray, and Zelda's dark hair developed silver streaks that she refused to hide. Their hands grew rough and calloused, their faces lined with time and sun and laughter. But their love never diminished. If anything, it grew deeper, richer, more essential. They became grandparents, first to William and Sarah's son, then to their twin daughters, then to Margaret's daughter, born while Margaret was finishing medical school. Each grandchild was a gift, a promise that what they had built would continue, that their legacy was not just land and cattle but love and values and family. One evening in 1905, as they sat on the porch of the house Brody had built for their 10th anniversary, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, Zelda took his hand. "You ever think about that first day, when I stepped off the train and you were so nervous?" Brody laughed. "I was terrified. I thought you would take one look at the burned ranch and get right back on the train." "I thought about it," she admitted, for about 5 seconds. And then I saw your face, and I knew you were a good man who had dealt with something terrible and was trying to make it right. And I thought, this is a man I could love. This is a man worth taking a chance on. Best chance I ever took was building that house and hoping you would stay. Best chance I ever took was coming here in the first place." She squeezed his hand, her grip still strong despite the years. "We built something beautiful, Brody. Not just the ranch, not just the family, but this us. We built a love that has lasted through everything. And will last forever," Brody said. "In this world and whatever comes after." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars emerge one by one in the darkening sky. From inside the house, they could hear Catherine playing the piano, something soft and sweet. In the distance, cattle lowed, and somewhere a coyote called its lonely song. Brody thought about the fire that had burned his father's house, about the desperation and fear he had felt that night. He thought about Zelda's letter arriving at exactly the right time, about her courage in coming west to marry a stranger, about the way she had looked at the rough two-room house and called it wonderful. He thought about every hard moment and every triumph, every child born and every harvest gathered, every sunrise and sunset they had witnessed together. "I would do it all again," he said quietly. "Every hard moment, every struggle, every worry. I would do it all again exactly the same because it led me here to you, to this life." "So would I," Zelda said, leaning her head on his shoulder. "So would I." As they grew older, they handed more responsibility to their children, but they never stopped working, never stopped contributing. Brody still rode out to check the cattle when he was nearly 70, his body protesting but his spirit willing. Zelda still taught, taking on students who needed extra help, refusing to charge families who could not afford it. They were part of the fabric of Rawlins, respected and loved, known for their generosity and their enduring love for each other. On their 40th anniversary in 1922, the town threw them a celebration. Everyone came, their children and grandchildren, Tom Henderson and his family, Mrs. Chen's daughter who now ran the store, the families whose children Zelda had taught over 4 decades, ranchers and townspeople and friends old and new. There was music and dancing and food, and at the center of it all were Brody and Zelda, gray-haired and wrinkled but still holding hands, still looking at each other with the same love that had sustained them through everything. William made a speech about his parents, talking about how they had built something from nothing, how they had shown everyone what was possible with hard work and dedication and love. Margaret, home from her medical practice in Denver, talked about how her mother had taught her that women could do anything they set their minds to. Robert and Catherine shared memories that had everyone laughing and crying in equal measure. When it was Brody's turn to speak, he stood with Zelda beside him, his arm around her waist, and looked out at the crowd of people who had become family. 40 years ago, he said, his voice still strong despite his age, I stood in the ruins of everything I owned and thought my life was over. I was wrong. My life was just beginning. Zelda came to a burned ranch, and instead of seeing disaster, she saw possibility. Instead of running, she stayed. Instead of giving up, she worked. She taught me that starting over is not failure, it is courage. She taught me that love is not something that happens to you, it is something you build day by day, choice by choice. Everything good in my life came from the moment she stepped off that train and decided to give me a chance. He turned to Zelda, and his voice softened. You are my love, my partner, my best friend. You made me a better man. You gave me a family and a home and a life beyond anything I could have imagined. I love you more today than I did 40 years ago, and I will love you for whatever time we have left. Zelda was crying, and so was half the crowd. She stood on her toes and kissed him, and everyone applauded, and Brody held her close and thought that this was what a life well lived looked like: love that endured, family that thrived, community that supported, and memories that would last long after they were gone. They lived 5 more years together, 5 years of watching their grandchildren grow, of welcoming great-grandchildren, of quiet evenings on the porch and gentle mornings in their bed. They were slower now, their bodies failing in small ways, but their love remained constant, the bedrock of everything. Brody died first, in his sleep on a cold January night in 1927, with Zelda beside him as she had been for 45 years. He was 72 years old. His last words to her were, "Thank you for staying. Thank you for loving me. Thank you for everything." Zelda held his hand as his breathing slowed and stopped, and she sat with him for a long time in the darkness, remembering everything: the burned ranch, the rough house, the struggles and triumphs, the children and grandchildren, the decades of love. She did not cry. Instead, she smiled, because she knew how lucky they had been, how rare and precious their love had been. She lived 2 more years, dying peacefully in her sleep at the age of 70, surrounded by her children and grandchildren. Her last words were about Brody, about the house he had built for her, about the life they had created together. They were buried side by side on a hill overlooking the ranch, with a view of the mountains and the creek and the land they had loved. Their gravestone was simple, just their names and dates and a single line that William had chosen. They built a life from ashes. The ranch continued under William's careful management, and then under his sons and his sons after that. The house Brody had built still stood, carefully maintained, a testament to solid construction and enduring love. The story of the mail-order bride who came to a burned ranch and the cowboy who rebuilt it for her became family legend, told to each new generation as an example of courage, determination, and the power of love to overcome any obstacle. And in Rawlins, Wyoming, where the wind still sang through the grass and the mountains still rose purple against the sky, people remembered Brody and Zelda Dalton as proof that the best things in life are not given but built, not found but created, not automatic but chosen, again and again, day after day, through fire and rebuilding, through struggle and triumph, through all the years of a life lived together in love. The story of their love, born in the ashes of disaster and nurtured through decades of hard work and unwavering commitment, remained an inspiration for generations. Their descendants continued to tell it at family gatherings, to share it with anyone who would listen, to hold it up as an example of what was possible when 2 people decided to face the world together, no matter what challenges arose. It was a story of the Wild West, yes, but more than that, it was a story of the human heart, its resilience, its capacity for love, its ability to build something beautiful even when everything seems lost. And that story, like the love it chronicled, would never truly die.